As John said, I was a diplomat. I had worked for the Department of State. I had been assigned to the Consulate General at Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. I had thought it was a State Department post until I got there. And I learned that of some 20 Americans there were only 3 people, including myself, who worked for the Department of State. There might have been a couple of more, but there were only 3 people whom I knew for certainty who was not tied to the CIA or to the National Security Agency. And when I first arrived, I was greeted with open arms. "Oh, Mike, we're glad you're here. Your predecessor was such a bitch." And I'd heard about this before leaving Washington. I had made a courtesy call on the then ambassador, Walter Cutler. It was simply, as from my side, simply to say, "Oh, Ambassador Cutler, I'm part of your new official family. I'm going out to Jeddah. I'll be there for maybe a year and a half, 2 years. Just wanted to say hello." Well, I got 45 minutes with him, and he spent most of the time telling me about all of the problems that they'd had with visas in Jeddah. He wouldn't say exactly what, but there were problems. This is really odd. I mean, the American ambassador is doing this for 45 minutes. He's got other things to do. He's in Washington on consultations. And I asked the desk officer, who is sort of the fellow who follows Saudi Arabia for the Department of State, and I said, "What was that all about?" And he says, "Well, Cutler's just a queer duck." I said, "All right." Well, once I got there, I began getting all these requests for visas for people who seem to have some peculiar backgrounds. And the way the law and the Department of State's holy book, the Foreign Affairs Manual, states that a person applying for a visa to enter the United States is that he is an intending immigrant unless and until he can prove otherwise. And the burden of proof is on him. Well, okay. And I looked at it, and well, if this is a good contact and you want to reward him, fine and dandy. And then it went on, and the guys' backgrounds were skeezier and skeezier, and I began rejecting them. I would simply say, "No, you're not going to get a visa." To give you one example of what it was like for a year and a half, these 2 guys came to me, and they were Pakistanis. And they were going to a trade show in the United States, and they called it the APA show. And I said, "Well, what's the APA show?" "Well, we don't know. It's a trade show." "Oh, yeah? Well, where is it?" "Oh, but it's in Detroit." And I said, "Okay." And I had worked at the Commerce Department prior to this in the Bureau of International Commerce, and knew from experience that it was the APAA show put on by the American Automotive Parts and Accessories Association, and it was held every year in Chicago at McCormick Place. So I refused them. You don't have a good reason. I'm sorry, you've had your 2 minutes. It doesn't work. Not long after that, I got a call from Paul Arvid Tveit, Tveit. He is a CIA clandestine service case officer, now retired and living in McLean, Virginia. And he said, "We need visas for these guys." And I said, "Why?" "Well, they're going to a trade show. It's a trade mission. We're sponsoring it." And I said, "Well, they can't name the trade show, and they can't name the city, and I don't think that they're going to the United States for a legitimate purpose. They're not getting a visa, period. Unless you yourself have, under the regulations, additional information that I don't have or didn't have when I interviewed these guys." "No." Okay, so then he called the chief of the consular section, Justice Stevens. And Stevens immediately issued the visa. Never got an explanation. Not too long after that, Karen Sasahara, who replaced Henry Enscher as the case officer masquerading as the political officer in the consulate, she wanted a visa for a Sudanese who was a refugee from the Sudan and was unemployed in Saudi Arabia. Well, he had to go to Washington. And I said, "Why?" "Well, he has to go." And I said, "No, he's not going to get the visa. I've interviewed him, I've refused him, and you can't give me any additional information that would persuade me that he's going to the United States and has ties strong enough to compel him to return once his business in Washington is concluded." So she goes to Justice Stevens. Justice issues the visa. And I said, "Justice, why?" Well, national security. Well, no further explanation. So this went on, and it went on, and it went on. I learned my predecessor, Greta Holtz, who still has a job with the State Department, had complained about this as well. And the Consul General, J. Philip Freres, who I don't think worked for the Department of State, and who's now retired and living in Clearwater, Florida, tried to get her thrown out of the State Department. And somebody apparently wised her up along the way, and she simply pulled in her horns and stopped complaining. I didn't. I think I should have complained more. But, thank you. So this went on, and it got to the point where an expediter would come over with 20 or 30 passports from a company and say, you can issue these visas now, or you can issue them later when Jay Freres tells you to do so. This is unheard of. And I complained. I complained to Justice Stevens, I complained to Jay Freres, I complained to Stephanie Smith, who's now retired and living somewhere in Florida, that, this is really strange. And by this time, Freres had ordered that I take all of the passports whose visa applications I had approved over to the CIA base, headed by Eric Qualkenbush, who's now retired and living in Findlay, Ohio, for their approval of my approval. I told this to Stephanie Smith, the counselor for consular affairs, and she says, well, this is really bad. When you rotate to your next assignment in Germany, go to Bureau of Consular Affairs in Washington and tell them about this. All right. Well, I did that, got to DC, and the Bureau of Consular Affairs couldn't be bothered. Now, there was an inspection team that came out to Jeddah, and they were essentially there to see how well managed and how efficient the consulate was. And the Joseph P. O'Neill, who's now retired, said to me, well, we've heard all these stories about the visa problem here. What can you tell me about it? And I didn't want to talk about it because I had been told by a contact that if you mention one word of this, you're going to be out on your ear. You'll be unemployed. And he kept on and on and on. We'll protect you. We'll protect you. And then he started reciting basics of what I've told you. And I said, all right, yeah, I'll confirm that. That's entirely correct. In fact, he knew a little bit more than I did. Then the Consul General really worked on me and says, you don't do this, you're going to get fired, period. And I said, this is really bizarre. So after I was out of the State Department, after having been assigned to the CIA's consulate in Stuttgart, where the last two consuls general, Day Mount and Douglas Jones, had worked for the agency and who did a number on me, telling the world that I was totally incompetent, didn't know what I was doing, and should be made unemployed. Well, once I was out, and my Freedom of Information Act requests were being denied, and my lawsuit had been shut down and sealed as a threat to national security, I ran into the journalist Joe Trento. And roughly at the same time, I came across a fellow connected with a local university in Washington, and with a guy who worked for another government agency who'd retired. And between the three of them, I learned that what this was not somebody simply paying money under the table to get a visa for people. It was a program designed to recruit fighters for the Afghan war to kill Soviets, to take them to Washington and train them in shooting things down and blowing things up. They also were brought to Washington for debriefings, as rewards, whatever. And I said, that's why they raised such hell when I denied the visas. And after September 11th, Joe Trento called me up and said, why don't you call the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and tell them the basics of this Visas for Terrorists program? And I did.